George Washington once had 4 bullets ripped through his coat, and 2 horses shot out from underneath him in the same battle. He walked away without a scratch. That's not a legend. That's a Tuesday in 1755, and it is nowhere close to the craziest thing this man did. By the time he was in his early 20s, George Washington had already survived disease, ambush, and a battlefield disaster that killed most of the men around him. He hadn't even become a general yet. He hadn't led a revolution yet. He was just a young officer with, apparently, the worst luck in the world and the best luck in the world at exactly the same time. Forget the marble statue. Forget the guy on the dollar bill staring off into the distance, like he's disappointed in you specifically. The real George Washington was 6'2" in an era when the average man was closer to 5'7". He had enormous hands. He was famous among his peers for his physical strength. And he spent his life doing things that, if you saw them in a movie, you'd assume were exaggerated for drama. Start with the horse. Washington was, by every contemporary account, one of the best horsemen in the colonies. Thomas Jefferson himself said Washington was the finest horseman of his age, not the finest general, not the finest statesman, the finest horseman. He would ride for hours a day, sometimes covering enormous distances just to inspect his land or check on his troops. And he did it in a way that made grown soldiers stop and stare. Now here's where it gets ridiculous. In 1755, as a young officer serving under British General Edward Braddock, Washington rode into what became known as the Battle of the Monongahela. The British and colonial forces were ambushed. It was chaos. Officers were being picked off the horses one by one. Washington had 2 horses shot dead underneath him during the fighting. He calmly got up, got on another horse, and kept going. When it was over, other officers found 4 bullet holes in his coat. 4. He never got hit once. His own mentor, an experienced military man, later said he didn't believe a bullet had been made that could kill George Washington. At the time, people genuinely thought he might be some kind of untouchable. Before any of that, though, a 17-year-old George Washington was already out working as a professional land surveyor on the wild edge of the Virginia frontier. This wasn't a summer job. This was weeks at a time in dense forest, sleeping outdoors, dealing with hostile terrain and the occasional very real threat of violence. Also, he could measure land for wealthy families like the Fairfaxes. He was good at it, really good. By 18, he had earned enough money surveying that he had effectively become his own small landowner, buying up frontier property while most teenagers today are still trying to get their license. That frontier experience is exactly what put him in the middle of an international incident before he turned 22. In 1754, young Lieutenant Colonel Washington led a small force into the Ohio Valley and ran into a group of French soldiers at a place called Jumonville Glen. What happened next is still debated by historians, but the short version is this. Shots were fired. A French officer ended up dead, and the incident helped ignite what became known as the French and Indian War, which then expanded into a massive global conflict between Britain and France called the 7 Years' War. A 21-year-old Virginia militia officer helped kick off a war that eventually spanned multiple continents. That's not an exaggeration. That's just what happened. Shortly after, Washington got the only formal military surrender of his entire career. Trapped at a hastily built post called Fort Necessity, badly outnumbered and fighting in the pouring rain with gunpowder getting soaked, he was forced to surrender to French forces. He signed the surrender document. It was written in French. Washington did not speak French. He unknowingly signed a document that included language essentially admitting to the assassination of the French officer killed at Jumonville Glen. It became a diplomatic headache that followed him for years. He wasn't done cheating death yet, either. A few years earlier, Washington survived smallpox after being infected on a trip to Barbados, one of the only times he ever left North America. Smallpox at the time had a mortality rate that could climb past 30%. He caught it, nearly died, and came out the other side with a face permanently scarred and, weirdly, a lifelong immunity that may have saved him again decades later when the disease tore through his own army during the Revolution. He also nearly drowned crossing an icy river as a young surveyor, got knocked into freezing water, and somehow made it to a small island where he had to spend the night soaked through in brutal cold with no fire. He survived that too. This man treated near death experiences the way most people treat a mildly annoying commute. But it wasn't just survival. Washington had a temper that could reportedly clear a room. People who worked closely with him described a man who was normally calm, controlled, almost eerily composed in public. And then, every so often, something would snap that control completely. There are accounts of him cursing out officers in language so intense that witnesses were stunned into silence because it was so wildly out of character for the otherwise buttoned-up commander. One story, told by a fellow officer, describes Washington swearing at General Charles Lee during the Battle of Monmouth with such ferocity that the leaves practically shook. He was not a guy you wanted to disappoint. There's a story from before the Revolution that captures this perfectly. During a heated election dispute in Virginia, Washington got into a shouting match with a man named William Payne. Payne, apparently unimpressed by Washington's size and reputation, knocked him clean off his feet with a wooden club. Washington's own men reportedly grabbed weapons and were ready to make Payne regret it permanently. Washington stopped them. The next day, instead of demanding a duel like most men of his era and social standing would have, he invited Payne to a tavern, apologized for his own part in the argument, and the two shook hands. He had every excuse to destroy the guy and chose not to. That restraint, sitting right next to that temper, is basically the whole contradiction of George Washington in one story. Then there's his strength, which contemporaries described almost like a superpower. People who knew him wrote that he could crack walnuts between his fingers. Farm workers told stories about him throwing objects farther than anyone else on the property. That famous tale about him throwing a silver dollar clear across the Potomac River is almost certainly false, mostly because silver dollars didn't even exist yet during his younger years. But the fact that people invented that legend at all tells you something about how physically imposing the man actually was in real life. You don't make up superhero strength stories about an average guy. Even his teeth have a wilder true story hiding behind a popular myth. Everyone has heard that George Washington had wooden teeth. He didn't. By the time he became president, he had almost no natural teeth left, and his dentures were actually crafted from a combination of ivory, gold, lead, and real human and animal teeth, some of which were purchased from enslaved people on his own plantation. A detail that adds a much darker and more complicated layer to the man behind the myth than the simple wooden teeth joke ever could. The dentures were famously uncomfortable, distorted his jaw, and are part of the reason he almost never smiled in any portrait. He was also, somewhat inconveniently for the myth of the humble founding father, obsessed with money, land, and gambling. Washington played cards constantly. He bet on horse races. He kept meticulous records of his winnings and losses, because Washington was the kind of man who tracked everything down to the penny. And those personal ledgers still exist today. He also loved to dance, reportedly for hours at a stretch at social gatherings, to the point where other guests would get tired before he did. And then there's the whiskey. After the Revolution, after 2 terms as president, after all of it, Washington went home to Mount Vernon and built what became the largest whiskey distillery in the entire country at the time. Not a hobby operation. An industrial-scale rye whiskey business producing tens of thousands of gallons a year. The most famous man in the new United States spent his retirement running one of its biggest liquor operations. Here's a story you were probably taught, and it's fake. The cherry tree. Young George chopping down his father's cherry tree, then confessing because he cannot tell a lie. It never happened. It was invented decades after Washington died by a biographer named Mason Locke Weems, who wanted to sell books by making Washington seem impossibly virtuous. Washington never said it. There was no tree. It was marketing. The real stories didn't need the exaggeration. He was already wild enough. Take the moment that arguably mattered more than any battle he ever fought. At the end of the Revolutionary War, some of his own officers were furious about unpaid wages and started talking about a coup. Some wanted Washington to just take power outright, maybe even become a king. He had the loyalty of the army. He had the reputation. He could have done it. Instead, he walked into a room full of angry officers, pulled out a pair of glasses nobody had seen him wear before, and said, quote, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country. That's it. That's the whole move." Grown men who had just been plotting a coup started weeping. The rebellion against him dissolved on the spot. Not because of a battle, but because of a single human moment from a man everyone assumed was unshakable. He would repeat that move on a larger scale a few years later. After winning the war, after becoming arguably the most powerful man on the continent, he resigned his military commission and walked away from power entirely. King George III, when told Washington intended to give up control and go back to farming, reportedly said that if Washington actually did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. He did it. Twice, actually. He also walked away from the presidency after 2 terms, when he legally could have stayed for life, and nobody would have stopped him. So here's the reframe. This was a man who dodged bullets like they were personally afraid of him, nearly died from disease and freezing rivers before he turned 25, cursed out generals hard enough to become military legend, ran one of the biggest whiskey operations in early America, and gambled on horse races in his spare time. And that same man had 2 separate chances to become something close to a king, and walked away from both on purpose. because he didn't think anyone should have that much power for that long. Tonight, when you picture George Washington, don't picture the guy on the dollar bill.